In the cobblestone streets of colonial Mexico, beneath the shadow of Baroque churches and silver-laden hills, death was supposed to be final. It was supposed to be peaceful. It was supposed to be the end of the story. But in the mountain city of Guanajuato, death had other plans. Here, in soil touched by ancient minerals and kissed by desert winds, the dead refused to rest. They waited, preserved in ways that nature never intended, until the day they would be dragged back into the light to face a world that had moved on without them. This is not a tale of Egyptian pharaohs wrapped in linen and prepared for eternity. This is not the story of saints whose bodies were sanctified and venerated. This is something far more unsettling, far more human, and far more real. This is the story of ordinary people who died in extraordinary circumstances, only to become unwilling exhibits in one of the world's most macabre museums. This is the story of the Mummies of Guanajuato, where death became a spectacle and the grave became a stage. The year was 1833. The place was Guanajuato, a colonial jewel nestled in the mountains of central Mexico, a city built on silver and sustained by the sweat of miners who carved their fortunes from the earth itself. It was a prosperous place, a beautiful place where Spanish architecture climbed the hillsides like white flowers blooming from stone. The churches rang their bells at dawn and dusk, marking time for a population that believed in the order of things, in the natural progression from life to death to eternal rest. But in 1833, that order was shattered by an invisible enemy that swept through the narrow streets like a plague of biblical proportions. Cholera had come to Guanajuato. It arrived without warning, without mercy, and without discrimination. The disease that had already devastated Europe and Asia now turned its hungry gaze upon this mountain city, transforming it from a place of prosperity into a charnel house of the dying. The outbreak was swift and merciless. First, the very young began to fall, their small bodies unable to fight the violent sickness that twisted their insides and drained them of life. Then the elderly, already weakened by years, succumbed to the relentless fever and dehydration. But cholera was not content with the vulnerable. It reached for everyone. Merchants who had counted their silver the day before were found dead in their shops. Miners who had descended into the earth healthy never returned to the surface alive. Mothers died clutching their children. Children died calling for mothers who could no longer answer. The speed of death was matched only by the speed of panic. In just a few weeks, the population was decimated. The living could barely keep pace with the dying. Bodies piled up faster than graves could be dug, faster than prayers could be said, faster than the proper rituals of death could be observed. The normal order of burial with its careful preparation and solemn ceremony collapsed under the weight of sheer necessity. In desperation, the authorities made a decision that would echo through the centuries. The dead had to be buried immediately, without delay, without the traditional rites, without the time needed to ensure that life had truly departed. Speed was everything. The disease could not be allowed to spread further, and the corpses were seen as vessels of contagion that had to be sealed away from the world of the living as quickly as possible. Mass graves were dug in the red earth outside the city. Single burials were carved hastily into hillsides. Above-ground crypts were sealed with bodies inside before the lime had even dried on the mortar. In the panic and confusion of those terrible weeks, corners were cut, traditions were abandoned, and in some cases the most horrifying mistake of all was made. Some of the dying, those whose breathing had grown so shallow as to be undetectable, those whose heartbeat had slowed to a whisper, were buried while the spark of life still flickered within them. The epidemic passed, as epidemics do. The living counted their losses, buried their grief, and slowly began the work of rebuilding their shattered community. The dead were left to rest in their hastily constructed graves in the crypts and mausoleums of what would become Guanajuato's main cemetery, Panteón Municipal. Life returned to something resembling normal. The silver mines reopened. The churches filled again with voices raised in prayer. Children played in streets that had been silent with death just months before. But beneath the ground, something unprecedented was happening. The bodies that had been buried in such haste and such panic were not following the normal path of decay and dissolution. The unique conditions of Guanajuato, the mineral-rich soil, the dry mountain air, the specific combination of altitude and climate, were working together to create a phenomenon that science had rarely documented and that the people of the city could never have imagined. The corpses were becoming mummified, not through the deliberate intervention of embalmers, not through the careful application of resins and salts, but through the accidental convergence of natural forces. The warm, arid environment was drawing moisture from the bodies faster than bacteria could cause decomposition. The soil, rich in zinc and arsenic, was acting as a natural preservative. The altitude of over 6,000 feet above sea level was creating conditions that halted the normal process of decay and transformation. In the darkness of their tombs, the dead of 1833 were being transformed into something else entirely. Their skin was drying and tightening. Their hair was being preserved as if frozen in time. Their clothes, the simple garments they had worn in their final moments, were becoming part of their eternal costume. They were becoming inadvertent monuments to their own mortality, preserved witnesses to a tragedy that the living world was already beginning to forget. For decades they waited in their accidental preservation, unknown and undisturbed. The cemetery grew around them, filled with the more recent dead who would follow the normal path from flesh to bone to dust. Families came to tend the graves of their loved ones, leaving flowers and prayers, never knowing that just a few feet away lay bodies that had refused to surrender to time. The discovery of this underground museum of the accidentally preserved would not come for more than 30 years. It would come not through scientific curiosity or archaeological excavation, but through the cold mathematics of municipal finance. It would come through a law that treated death as a commodity, and graves as real estate to be rented rather than sacred ground to be honored. In 1865, the city of Guanajuato passed an ordinance that would forever change the relationship between the living and the dead. They instituted what they called a burial tax, a perpetual fee that families would be required to pay to maintain their relatives' resting places. It was presented as a practical measure, a way to manage the growing cemetery and generate revenue for municipal improvements. Pay the tax and your loved ones could rest in peace forever. failed to pay, and they would be evicted from eternity itself. This law would remain in effect for 95 years, creating a grim economic hierarchy in the realm of the dead. Only those families who could afford the ongoing fees could ensure their relatives remained undisturbed. The poor, the forgotten, those with no living descendants to pay their posthumous rent faced a fate worse than death itself. They faced a second burial, an exile from their graves, a removal from the very ground they had been promised would be their final resting place. The first to face this fate was a man whose story would become legend, whose preserved form would become the inaugural exhibit in what would grow into one of the world's most controversial museums. His name was Dr. Remigio Leroy, and he was a foreigner in a land that would soon forget him. A French physician who had come to the Silver Mountains of Mexico seeking opportunity and perhaps a new beginning, he had established himself as a respected member of Guanajuato society. But when death claimed him in 1860, he left behind no family to tend his grave, no descendants to pay the fees that would keep him in his eternal rest. 5 years later, when the cemetery workers came with their shovels and their official papers, Dr. Leroy became the first casualty of Guanajuato's burial tax. His body was to be disinterred, removed from his crypt to make room for someone whose family could afford the perpetual rent on death. The workers expected to find what they always found when graves were opened after years in the ground. They expected bones, perhaps some scraps of clothing, the inevitable dust that all flesh becomes. Instead, they found a miracle of preservation that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. When the lid of Dr. Leroy's coffin was pried open, the men stepped back in shock and terror. There, lying as if he had been buried yesterday, was the French doctor himself. His skin was dark and leathery, stretched tight over his bones, but it was intact. His hair remained on his skull, his mustache perfectly preserved beneath his nose. Most remarkably of all, his elegant burial suit, the formal attire of a 19th-century gentleman, clung to his frame as if tailored for eternity itself. The workers had expected to find a skeleton. Instead, they found a man who looked as if he might sit up and demand to know why his rest had been disturbed. Word of this impossible discovery spread through Guanajuato like wildfire. People came to see for themselves this miracle of preservation. This man who had cheated the normal processes of decay and dissolution. Dr. Leroy was not returned to dust as Scripture promised, but had been transformed into something between life and death, between the mortal and the eternal. The cemetery workers, faced with this unprecedented situation, made a decision that would change the character of death itself in Guanajuato. Rather than dispose of this perfectly preserved corpse, they propped him up in a storage building near the cemetery. And when curious townspeople came to see this wonder, they charged them a few pesos for the privilege. Dr. Leroy had become in death what he had never been in life. He had become an attraction, but he would not remain alone for long, as the burial tax continued to claim its victims. As more families fell behind on their payments or died out entirely, more bodies were exhumed from the cemetery grounds. And with each disinterment came the possibility of another miracle, another impossibly preserved corpse that defied the natural order of things. The pattern became clear as the decades passed. Roughly 10% of the bodies removed from their graves had undergone the same mysterious transformation as Dr. Leroy. They emerged from their tombs not as bones or dust, but as leather skin, desiccated but recognizably human figures. Men, women, children, infants, all preserved by the unique alchemy of Guanajuato's soil and climate. Each discovery brought new crowds of the curious and the morbid. The storage building near the cemetery became an unofficial museum, a place where the living could come face to face with death itself, preserved and displayed like specimens in some macabre laboratory. The cemetery workers grew rich from their grim enterprise, charging admission to see the growing collection of the accidentally immortal. Among these preserved figures was a collection that told the story of 19th century Guanajuato in ways that no history book ever could. There were miners, their lungs still showing the black stains of the silver dust that had killed them. There were mothers who had died in childbirth, their bodies locked forever in the final moments of their struggle to bring life into the world. There were children dressed as angels, their small forms prepared for heaven but trapped forever in the realm between worlds. Most disturbing of all was the collection of infants, babies who had lived only days or weeks before succumbing to the diseases that stalked the young in that era before modern medicine. These tiny figures, some no larger than dolls, were dressed in the elaborate christening gowns and burial clothes that their grieving parents had hoped would ease their passage into the afterlife. Instead, they had become eternal children, frozen in death but visible to any paying visitor who wished to stare into their preserved faces. The expressions on these mummified faces became the source of endless speculation and dread. Unlike the peaceful death masks of Egyptian mummies or the serene countenances of saints, the Guanajuato mummies bore expressions that seemed to speak of terror, of anguish, of final moments filled with suffering. Their mouths hung open as if caught in mid-scream. Their eye sockets stared accusingly at visitors. Their hands were often clenched in fists or raised as if warding off some unseen horror. Local folklore grew around these tortured expressions. Some said they were evidence of divine punishment, that those who had been preserved in this manner were being forced to endure eternal suffering for sins committed in life. Others whispered that the faces revealed the truth of their final moments, that these were people who had been buried alive in the panic of the cholera epidemic, who had awakened in their coffins and died again in terror and desperation. The most famous and horrifying of these cases was that of Ignacia Aguilar, a woman whose mummified form would become both the crown jewel and the darkest secret of the growing collection. Ignacia had suffered from a rare condition that caused her heart to slow to nearly imperceptible levels, creating episodes where she appeared to be dead but was merely in a state of suspended animation. During the chaos of the 1833 epidemic, when bodies were being buried as quickly as possible to prevent the spread of disease, Ignacia had suffered one of these episodes. Her family, believing she had succumbed to cholera like so many others, had buried her with all the haste that the crisis demanded. But Ignacia's heart had not stopped forever. In the darkness of her coffin, she had awakened to the ultimate nightmare, trapped beneath the earth with no hope of rescue and no possibility of escape. When her body was finally exhumed decades later, the evidence of her terrible fate was unmistakable. She had been found face down in her coffin, her body twisted as if she had tried to push open the lid with her back. Her arms were raised above her head in a desperate gesture of defiance against her premature burial. Most horrifically of all, she had bitten down on her own arm in her final agony, and her mouth was still filled with dried blood, a testament to the desperation of her last moments. Ignatia's mummy became one of the most famous and most disturbing exhibits in what was rapidly becoming Guanajuato's primary tourist attraction. Visitors would stare in fascination and horror at this woman who had died twice, first from her mysterious condition, and then from the slow suffocation of premature burial. Her twisted form served as a reminder of the panic and confusion that had gripped the city during the cholera epidemic, when the living had been so desperate to separate themselves from the dead that they had sometimes buried the merely unconscious alongside the truly deceased. As the collection grew, so did its reputation. By the early 20th century, people were traveling from across Mexico and beyond to see the mummies of Guanajuato. What had begun as a local curiosity had become an international sensation, a place where tourists could confront their own mortality in the most direct and unsettling way possible. But the growth of this macabre tourism came at a cost to the dignity of the displayed dead and the sensibilities of the living. The early displays of these preserved corpses were as primitive as they were disturbing. For decades, the mummies were simply propped against the walls of the storage building like mannequins in some grotesque shop window. Ropes were tied around their torsos to keep them upright, creating an obscene parody of life as visitors filed past these standing figures who had once walked the same streets, breathed the same mountain air, and lived the same hopes and fears as those who now stared at them in fascination. There was no reverence in these early exhibitions, no attempt to honor the humanity of the displayed dead. They were curiosities, oddities, specimens to be gawked at by paying customers who saw them not as former people but as entertainment. The lack of proper preservation methods meant that the mummies were slowly deteriorating even as they drew crowds. Dust accumulated on their leathery skin. Their clothing, already fragile from decades in the ground, began to crumble and fall away. Most shamefully of all, some visitors began breaking off pieces of the mummies as souvenirs, snapping fingers and toes from the preserved corpses to take home as macabre mementos of their visit. This cavalier treatment of human remains revealed something deeply troubling about the relationship between the living and the dead in this new age of mummy tourism. These were not ancient pharaohs from a distant civilization, not foreign kings whose deaths were separated from the present by millennia of history. These were neighbors, fellow citizens, people whose grandchildren might still be walking the streets of Guanajuato. Yet they had been transformed from individuals with names and stories into nameless exhibits, reduced to their most sensational physical characteristics and the circumstances of their preservation. The cemetery workers who profited from this exhibition gave the mummies nicknames based on their appearance rather than seeking to identify who they had actually been in life. There was the screaming woman whose jaw had fallen open in what appeared to be an eternal cry of anguish. There was the smallest mummy, a tragic infant whose preservation seemed to mock the very idea of a peaceful death. There was the pregnant woman, whose swollen belly contained the world's youngest mummy, a fetus that had died with its mother and been preserved alongside her in a double tragedy that visitors found both fascinating and horrifying. These nicknames served to further dehumanize the displayed corpses, transforming them from individuals who had lived and loved and suffered into mere attractions defined by their most sensational characteristics. The screaming woman had once been someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's mother. The pregnant woman had once felt her unborn child moving within her, had made plans for a future that cholera had stolen away. The infant had once been the precious hope of grieving parents who had dressed their tiny corpse in the finest clothes they could afford. But in death and display, they had been stripped of their identities and reduced to their shock value. The scientific community began to take notice of this unprecedented collection of naturally preserved human remains. Researchers from universities across Mexico and the United States came to study the mummies, seeking to understand the unique conditions that had created this accidental preservation. They discovered that the process was far more complex than simple dehydration. The soil of Guanajuato contained unusual concentrations of minerals, particularly arsenic and zinc, which had antimicrobial properties that helped prevent the bacterial decay that normally reduces corpses to bones and dust. The altitude of the city, more than 6,000 feet above sea level, created atmospheric conditions that accelerated the drying process, while the relatively stable temperature in the underground crypts prevented the extreme fluctuations that would have disrupted preservation. Most importantly, the bodies had been sealed in above-ground vaults rather than buried directly in the earth, allowing air circulation that promoted desiccation while protecting the corpses from the moisture that would have caused normal decomposition. These scientific findings only added to the attraction of the collection. Visitors came not just to be shocked and they believed was a miracle of nature entertained, but to witness what a phenomenon so rare that it occurred in only one other location in Mexico. The mummies became symbols of Guanajuato itself, ambassadors of the city's unique character and evidence of its special place in the natural order of things. But as the 20th century progressed, the primitive conditions of the exhibition became increasingly problematic. The building where the mummies were stored was not climate-controlled, allowing temperature and humidity fluctuations that threatened the very preservation that made the collection possible. The lack of proper security meant that theft and vandalism continued to plague the exhibits. Most seriously, the growing crowds of visitors created a constant stream of human breath and body heat that was slowly destroying the delicate balance that had preserved the corpses for so long. In 1969, the city of Guanajuato made the decision to formalize what had been an informal attraction for over a century. They established the Museum of the Mummies, creating a proper facility with controlled environmental conditions, professional lighting, and most importantly, protective glass cases that would shield the mummies from the damaging effects of human contact while still allowing visitors to observe them in detail. The new museum represented a significant upgrade in the treatment and presentation of the collection. Each mummy was placed in an individual climate-controlled case with specialized lighting designed to minimize further deterioration while maximizing visibility. Information placards were installed to provide context about the preservation process and the historical circumstances that had created the collection. The mummies were no longer simply propped against walls like mannequins, but were presented as specimens worthy of scientific and historical interest. Yet even this improved presentation could not entirely escape the fundamental ethical questions that surrounded the display of human remains for entertainment and profit. These were not volunteers who had donated their bodies to science, not individuals who had consented to posthumous exhibition. They were victims of circumstance, people who had been thrust into public view by a combination of natural preservation and economic necessity, transformed against their will from private individuals into public spectacles. The museum's official opening in 1970 marked the beginning of a new era in the history of the Guanajuato Mummies. No longer were they a local curiosity known mainly to residents of the city and occasional adventurous travelers. They became an international attraction, featured in travel guides and documentary films, visited by hundreds of thousands of tourists each year who came to Guanajuato specifically to see the preserved corpses that had made the city famous. The economic impact was immediate and substantial. The museum became the second largest source of revenue for the city after property taxes, generating millions of dollars annually from admission fees, gift shop sales, and the secondary economic benefits of tourism. Hotels filled with visitors who had come to see the mummies. Restaurants served meals to tourists who would spend hours discussing what they had witnessed in the museum. Souvenir shops sold everything from postcards featuring photographs of the preserved corpses to candy shaped like tiny mummies, commercializing death in ways that would have been unimaginable to the people whose remains had made it all possible. The success of the museum also inspired cultural productions that spread the fame of the Guanajuato Mummies far beyond Mexico. Horror films featuring reanimated versions of the preserved corpses became staples of Mexican cinema, with masked wrestlers battling supernatural versions of Dr. Leroy and his fellow exhibits. Science fiction writers like Ray Bradbury visited the museum and drew inspiration from the experience, creating stories that captured the existential dread of confronting one's own mortality in such a direct and unsettling way. Bradbury's account of his visit revealed the profound psychological impact that the museum could have on sensitive visitors. He described being so traumatized by the sight of the preserved corpses that he suffered nightmares for weeks afterward, dreams in which he himself was trapped among the displayed dead, propped up against the museum walls for eternity. His terror was so intense that he channeled it into fiction, writing stories that attempted to purge himself of the horror he had witnessed in those glass cases. This psychological impact became part of the museum's appeal for many visitors. They came not just to see something unusual or educational, but to test themselves against their own fears of death and decay. The mummies offered a safe way to confront mortality, to stare into the face of death without actually dying, to experience the thrill of horror without real danger. It was a form of dark tourism that fed on humanity's fundamental anxieties about the end of life and what might lie beyond it. The preserved faces of the mummies, with their apparent expressions of terror and anguish, became central to this psychological appeal. Visitors would spend long minutes studying these faces, searching for clues about the final moments of the people they had once belonged to. Were these expressions evidence of suffering at the moment of death, or were they simply the result of natural processes that occurred after life had ended? The ambiguity was part of the attraction, allowing each visitor to project their own fears and interpretations onto the silent figures behind the glass. Scientific analysis would eventually provide more prosaic explanations for these disturbing expressions. The apparent screaming faces were largely the result of jaw muscles relaxing after death, causing the mouth to fall open in what only appeared to be a cry of anguish. The clenched fists and raised arms were products of the mummification process itself, as drying tissues contracted and pulled the limbs into positions that seemed to suggest struggle or desperation, but were actually the inevitable result of dehydration and tissue shrinkage. Yet these scientific explanations did little to diminish the emotional impact of viewing the mummies. Knowledge of the preservation process could not entirely dispel the visceral reaction that most visitors experienced when confronted with these preserved remnants of human life. The mummies remained powerful symbols of mortality, memento mori that reminded the living of their own inevitable fate, while simultaneously offering the tantalizing possibility that death might not be the complete ending they had always assumed it to be. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Museum of the Mummies had become something unprecedented in the annals of death and remembrance. It was no longer simply a collection of accidentally preserved corpses, but a cultural phenomenon that reflected humanity's complex relationship with mortality itself. The mummies had transcended their origins as victims of circumstance and municipal policy to become symbols of something deeper and more troubling about the human condition. The museum's success had spawned imitators and competitors across Mexico and beyond. Other cities with unusual burial conditions began excavating their own cemeteries, searching for preserved remains that might draw tourists and revenue. Archaeological sites that had once focused on ancient civilizations began emphasizing their mummified discoveries, marketing death as entertainment for a global audience hungry for authentic encounters with mortality. The Guanajuato model had created an entire industry built upon the display of human remains, transforming what had once been sacred ground into commercial space. Yet even as the museum thrived financially, questions about the ethics of its mission grew more persistent and more troubling. Human rights organizations began to scrutinize the practice of displaying identifiable human remains without consent from the deceased or their descendants. International museum standards evolved to require more rigorous justification for the exhibition of human bodies, emphasizing educational value over entertainment and demanding respect for the dignity of the dead. The casual commercialization that had characterized the early decades of the museum began to seem increasingly problematic in an age more conscious of cultural sensitivity and human rights. The mummies themselves continued to deteriorate despite the improved preservation methods of the modern museum. Time and exposure were taking their inevitable toll on bodies that had survived more than a century. through a combination of accident and favorable conditions. Hair fell from skulls, skin cracked and peeled. Clothing that had seemed miraculously preserved began to disintegrate into dust and fragments. The very act of displaying these corpses was slowly destroying them, creating a paradox where the attempt to share their remarkable preservation was ensuring their eventual destruction. New technologies offered both hope and additional complications. Advanced forensic techniques could potentially identify individual mummies, reconnecting them with historical records and living descendants who might have strong feelings about their ancestors being on public display. DNA analysis could reveal family relationships and genetic conditions that had contributed to their deaths. Three-dimensional scanning could create perfect digital replicas that might eventually replace the physical remains in the museum displays. Yet each technological advance raised new questions about consent, privacy, and the rights of the dead in an age when death was no longer necessarily the end of one's public existence. The stories of individual mummies began to emerge from decades of anonymity as researchers worked to restore their identities and histories. Dr. Leroy was no longer just the first mummy discovered, but a flesh and blood individual whose medical practice and social connections could be traced through historical records. The woman known for decades only as the Screaming Mummy was revealed to be Maria Santos, a mother of 3 who had died at age 28 during the height of the cholera epidemic. The infant mummies were given names and connected to families whose grief had been recorded in parish registers and cemetery records. Today, the Mummies of Guanajuato continue to draw 500,000 visitors annually. Their silent forms bearing witness to humanity's endless fascination with death and our desperate need to find meaning in mortality. They remain trapped between worlds, neither properly buried nor truly alive. Eternal prisoners of circumstance, who remind us that sometimes the most profound horror lies not in the supernatural, but in the all-too-human capacity to transform tragedy into spectacle. In Guanajuato, death refused to rest, and in doing so, it revealed truths about ourselves that we may not have been ready to face.